Hello, and welcome to Lights Camera Author, where we go beyond the pages to meet the writers bringing history, Hollywood, and popular culture to life. And I'm your host, Jim Juno. And few stars have ever captured the public imagination quite like Greta Garbo. During Hollywood's golden age, she became one of the world's most recognizable women. Yet decades after her retirement, Garbo remains an enigma, admired for her artistry, fascinated over her privacy, and remembered as one of cinema's most influential figures. My guest today is Scott Reisfield, and he has a new book out called Greta Garbo and the Rise of the Modern Woman. And you say, and Scott, welcome to Lights Camera Author.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on the show, Jim.
Now, let everybody know, I'm really fanboying right now because Greta Garbo was your great aunt, and you actually knew the woman.
Yeah,
So, and like we were talking in the pre-interview, tell me again, if you don't mind, tell me again what that was like.
sure. Well, I grew up in northern New Jersey, and she was living in New York at the time. She moved to New York permanently in the mid 50s. And she was very close with my mom. And we would go into New York, or she would come out to visit us. And she would just be there. I mean, she'd be like we had a pool in our backyard. She would just be sitting at the pool. She would have dinner. She would go for walks. Um, and her focus was, I gotta say, more on my parents or my grandparents when they came to visit, which happened a fair amount. But she did spend time with all four of us. There are four kids, and she was great. She was a really interesting and engaging person. A conversation with her, even when I was like 8 felt like she was very engaged and interested, and it was fun. So she was a fun person.
I gotta ask you this, and and maybe she didn't do it in front of you, but did she ever talk about her Hollywood days at all?
Well, yeah, actually, she and I had one conversation later in my life when I was in my 20s. I had just started working in my first sort of career job after business school, and I was kind of frustrated. And I mean, I guess I got a parable tale of, you know, her contract negotiations with MGM. And basically I think the message was know your worth or walk. This is, just a discussion of the problems I had with MGM. And the interesting thing about that is after she signed this 5-year deal in 1927, she and MGM got along famously from that point on. She sort of drew a line in the sand, wouldn't get pushed over. And, once it was all resolved, okay, this is how we're going to go forward together. It was a good working relationship. I changed
Wow.
jobs.
One phrase in your book really stood out to me. You write, Hollywood made her a star. What she did for women made her a legend. Now, what does that statement mean for you?
Well, I think what's been lost over time is why she was a star. Okay, so she's a star, but she had a very specific impact, and you can see it in how people reacted to her. So, when the reason Louis B. Mayer hired her was because he saw she was talented in her first film. And his comment to his daughter was that Garbo reminded him of Norma Talmadge, who was the most naturalistic styled actor in Hollywood at that time in the mid 20s. Uh, and so Garbo came to Hollywood with this very different style of naturalistic acting. I think most people, when they look at silent films, they notice this vaudevillian quality to the acting
Mm.
because that was the style. And the style in theater was vaudevillian too. I mean, even serious Broadway theater, an actor would give a soliloquy not to the other actor but to the audience, right? It was very focused on the performance for the audience, not like you're peering into real everyday life. And Garbo came with this very naturalistic style. She would write back to her friend Mimi Pollock, the directors don't tell me what my interior life of the characters like. I have to make it up myself. And so she created these characters that resonated with the audience from the first film, which was incredibly unusual because it was different and because it was accessible. Her audience felt uh, like they were in the room with her, not watching somebody on screen. And that, especially for the women in the audience, that the thoughts they believed Garbo was having, that they read through her acting, were the thoughts they would have,
Mm.
especially in what I would call modern woman dilemmas. What, you're not a Victorian woman, you don't want to live like a Victorian woman, but you're trying to figure out how to be more modern and, how do you deal with, you know, errors you might make in your life that in a Victorian life would have been socially catastrophic. But in this new modern world, it's a different game. How do you work it out? So she spoke to those, and Thalberg and MGM were very clever to use her in films that spoke to that audience. They were finding properties for her to allow her to do this. But in this slow, continuing, and in some ways still ongoing evolution of the place of women in society, after women got the right to vote, there was in some ways this long pause where they didn't acquire many other rights. They were still
Right.
sort of second class. They weren't getting paid their jobs they weren't allowed to do. But in that, there was this redefinition of female life. They got more agency. They could work, and they were pretty independent until they got married. And then maybe sort of married life looked like traditional life, husband and wife in a house, and the husband's in charge. But he's not in charge in exactly the same way. And all of the little negotiations that happened in houses all over, the world, uh, benefited in the female part of the equation from what Garbo was teaching them and showing them. And Garbo wasn't alone. There are other actors, the Joan Crawfords and Norma Shares and everybody else who were doing this too, even before Garbo. She just was better at it, resonated more with the audience, and then everybody copied her in terms of their acting styles. So, I mean, that's a long answer, but that's why I
No, no,
think
it's cool. Yeah.
Greta Garbo and the Rise of the Modern Woman, because it was central to what she did for people. And yeah, she did it through acting and photography. Uh, but it's been somewhat forgotten because, we went through a very conservative social period, between World War II, even before with the Depression, and especially the McCarthy era. And she was sort of forgotten.
True. I mean, now we'll be fair here because some of that was her own doing because I believe in 1941 she stepped away from the screen after the movie Two-Faced Woman.
Yeah, well, I go into this in my book. She actually kept trying to make films up until at least 1955. I found 7 projects after Two-Faced Woman that she agreed to do or would have agreed to do. And they didn't come to fruition for a variety of reasons, but the underlying thread is a censorship issue. She wanted to play these very contemporary women, interesting women. and that was hard to get approved. And in fact, censorship was the issue with Two-Faced Woman. Uh, it got pulled from distribution and had to be re-edited
That's
because
true.
the
Yeah,
Legion of Decency condemned it. And it really wasn't, to be honest, a particularly provocative film. It was kind of a political play by the Legion to seize control of American culture, and it succeeded.
that's true. Yes, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Two-Faced Woman, it was a comedy, and Garbo played. She gets married right away in the movie
Yeah.
to I'm drawing a blank here with the
Melvin Douglas.
Melvin Douglas. Yes, same actor from Ninotchka. Yes, and but then he goes back. She's a ski instructor. He goes back to the city because he was just on vacation, and she stays. She wanted to keep skiing, but she goes into the city after after he goes to the city, doesn't tell him that she's there, and pretends to be the sister, imaginary sister of his wife, and they kind of have a relationship, and that's where the that's where the Legion of Decency said, "Wait a minute here, this is immoral."
Yep,
Or
that's the issue.
it was, yeah. So and really, I mean, I can see her point where it's like, if I can't make the movies I want to make, why should I make the movies? I
Yeah.
mean, she has enough money, right?
Yeah, and I think you know, I think that was the biggest part of it, but I think there are some other things. I think Hollywood had changed. She really worked well with Irving Thalberg, who,
Mm.
took care of her. And he had died, MGM was changing, and I think she was used to it all just coming together. You know, the films that she signed to do that got killed because of censorship, you can see that part of the problem is when the Production Code Administration talked to Thalberg, he would compromise on points. He wouldn't get everything he wanted, but he'd ask for this and they'd say whatever, and they'd have this negotiation. But when they finished, the PCA trusted Thalberg to make a film within the spirit of their agreement. And I think one of the issues is people were unsure of trusting, somebody like Walter Wanger um,
Yes.
to do what he said, you know, because he had a reputation for doing what he wanted anyway, justly earned. Um, so a lot of it was censorship. Some of it was just the slow decay of the studio system, making it more difficult for her to get in the kind of projects he wanted. She was older. There just aren't as many roles for older women. But the projects that didn't happen that she found, some of them are fascinating conceptually. They would have been great potentially. I mean, you never know with film, right?
Right.
Garbo, when
Hmm.
she sort of gained control of her career, tried to make basically seven great films and she hit on four. So nobody hits on all of them.
Exactly. Now, and a lot of people know Greta Garbo, as just a movie star. But you realize that, and or when did you realize that she was much more than that? I mean, she was a cultural icon.
Well, it sort of came in pieces. Um, I knew her growing up. I knew that she, was a movie star. At some point, I realized she was an exceedingly famous movie star.
Hmm.
Um, but, in my teenage years and young adult life, and even my early professional life, she wasn't making films. Her movies were available at, revival houses or, on TV, but they weren't big news, right? They were small news. So, um, and all ever people sort of wrote about her was this recluse meme that had been created in the
Yeah.
50s, which was really dismissive, which, I'm talking about the 70s, and that's an era where women are being dismissed, right? That's, socially
Yeah.
fits with the times. But I I realized first that the books that had been written didn't really kind of capture her. And I didn't quite understand why originally. But then I realized some of the things I learned that weren't correct sort of took away her agency, right? So she goes to New York in 1925 because she has a letter of intent with MGM. It's a 5-year deal, 1 year guaranteed, and then 4 years at MGM's option, which was the
Mhm.
standard studio approach to new people. So she arrives and she signed that letter of intent underage. It has no value. And she knows this. And she comes to New York to sign a 1 year deal. And they spend 2 months negotiating, and she signs a 3 year deal. So they gave a little, she gave a little. She was concerned at the time because her sister had leukemia. And,
Uh,
there's some question as to her health. So she didn't want to leave for long. She did want to see what Hollywood was like. She'd made a Swedish film, she'd made a German film, she understood those industries. Uh, UFA had offered her a contract. So she's coming to New York to see what's what. And she spends 2 months and then they sign a deal and she goes to Hollywood. Well, the photographer, Arnold Genthe, who took these fantastic photos of her, wrote in his autobiography that MGM was going to send her back to Sweden, but he interceded using the photos he had taken of Garbo. Well, that's not true. He just
yeah.
made that up. And they're fantastic photos, but he's lying to make
Yes.
himself central to her career. And there's several instances like that. And it's like, as I saw this, it's like, no, she's much more intentional than people realize. So people use that Genthe story because they don't understand. People didn't understand she was underage when she signed the letter of intent. So they didn't understand why she spent 2 months in New York. So everybody had to figure it out. So once I understood the underage issue, then it's like, oh, okay, now this makes sense. So now that I learned relatively early, the Gentha story, but I found a number of similar kinds of things, a lot starting during COVID when I started this project. This is my COVID project because I had to
Is
close
that what it
my
was?
company.
Okay.
My company
Oh
was
no.
not COVID resilient. And I had just opened it. So it was sort of one of these, well, I'm just going to close it. And now what am I going to do with my time? Otherwise, without COVID, I probably would never have written this book. Um, but
You know, a lot of go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
started to see all these instances where her agency was taken away by the way people told stories about her. And some were intentional and some were not. I mean, some were just people going, well, if this is true and this is true, I'll say this. Um, but they're missing uh, the intent of what she's doing, and the focus and the skill set she's bringing. So I had spoken before about how different her acting style was. Well, other people had found some of these quotes, but if you group them all together, she arrives in Hollywood and people are in the industry are just stunned by her on film. They're just like, oh, this is different, right? Well, that's from intent. So
What do you think? A lot of people say Maurice Stiller was instrumental, but did your research did that bear that out?
absolutely. Um, she uh, had worked in industrial films and she took that money and put it into acting lessons, which is another thing most people didn't realize. She spent 6 to 12 months taking acting lessons before she applied to Dramaten, the Swedish Royal Theatre School. So she gets to Dramaten and they're instantly impressed by her skill set from the beginning. So they're putting her on stage uh, in her first year, which they didn't do for very many people. And she also came in with an exceedingly strong class. The people she was in Dramaten with, the class before her, her class, and the class after her, is like a huge part of Swedish theater, cinema, and TV for decades. They're a very talented group. Um, and so they're putting her on stage. Stiller, first off, Stiller knows the guy who was doing her industrial films. They're good friends. Um, they hang out together while Ragnar Ring is editing his films. They're that
Uh,
close.
wow.
So he's seen her probably. She's at Dramaten. Dramaten is run by somebody Stiller knows well, so he's seeing her on stage, and he ends up casting her in Josta Berling, and she does a good job. Um, and I think from that point, well, first off, Stiller thought she was talented and brought her into this production, Josta Berling. But somewhere during the production, he realized that she was a world-class film talent
Mm.
and that she was willing to do the work to develop that talent. And so he went to work to help her become, the greatest film star that she could be. And their relationship was professional at all times, but it was also romantic at times. It was sort of this on again, off again romance because they were both very aware of the age difference. He was significantly older than she was. And so, they get to the United States, and he's telling people in the Swedish community, I'm too old for her. She should really be dating somebody else. Um, but in the end, um, it's on again, off again, as I said. He returns to Sweden, and a letter I do not have. She writes him a letter. I have his response, which is, well, if that's the way you feel, we should get married. Right. So she's going to go back to Sweden after Wild Orchids, and she goes shopping with Lillian uh, Tashman to buy dresses for her trip back to Sweden. To like, we're going to, knock the natives dead with these dresses. Right? She's really going all out. And then Stiller dies,
Oh,
so it never turned into what she probably had hoped. Um,
exactly.
so
She became the most famous. pe- I remember went reading that she was America's most famous recluse. Um, but she really wasn't. I mean, she'd go out shopping and walk on New York streets, and there was even some joker who would follow her around with a camera that, really kind of disgusted me that he would do that. But why do you think the public became so fascinated with her privacy?
well, one of the things I read this book by a paparazzi, and he was explaining what they did. So, and this all started in Italy. These photographers would take a picture of a star on vacation, and a newspaper or a magazine would pay them $100, which was nothing. Well, if they took that same picture and created a story around it, now they'd sell it for $1,000. So the Garbo story was recluse, right? It did fit with her. She was a private person. Um, Recluse in early Hollywood were those stars who didn't go to the party circuit. That was sort of also a PR circuit. And
Right.
there were like 20 relatively well-known stars who didn't do that. And she was one of them. They were all called recluses. So they're already using that term. But then after the war, the Italians, and she would go to the Riviera uh, every summer for the 50s, basically, before she switched to going to Switzerland. But they would try to take pictures of her, and the caption was always, Greta Garbo, the recluse. And my favorite ones of these are the ones when George Schley, who was a romantic partner later in life, is holding up his hand to block the shot. And the caption is Garbo hides from the camera. And she's just walking. Um, and so it was a convention, and she wasn't doing anything else. She was private. She wasn't doing interviews, but I don't think she's that different from, say, a Jodie Foster, who doesn't do interviews unless she's got a project coming out and lives a very private life. Garbo didn't necessarily do Hollywood interviews, but she used to go back and forth to Sweden by boat, during her MGM career. And almost always she would give interviews on her return, right, when she's coming back to make another movie. So there are interviews. They're just not where the usual Hollywood interviews are. They're not in photoplay. They're in the New York Times.
Ah,
So it's
okay.
just in a different place.
What did you discover about her personal relationships that surprised you? Because a lot of people have said everything about her,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, she had a number of personal relationships. She didn't talk about them. So I'm sure there are relationships that I don't know about. Um, but what surprised me, well, I did not know until I found the letter that she was going to marry Stiller. That was
Mm.
interesting. But later in life, she fell in love with a gentleman, George Schley, during World War II, and they were together until his death in 1964. And I didn't realize how serious that relationship was because he was married to someone else. Um,
Mm.
and and his wife dated had a lover on the side too. So it was all kind of out in the open, very European. Um, but there's some interesting things I found in letters. She wrote letters to my grandmother, and the one I like, she said, "Well, Schley is coming to visit again, and he'd better behave with the dishes or I'll send him away." Basically he doesn't help out around the house, he's not staying. So she, very, very much about equality in the household, right? My boyfriend had better help with cooking and dishes.
Another reason you should buy a dishwasher. So, after all these years, now, well, you're her grandnephew, so you have it gives you a unique perspective on this story. So, did that influence your understanding of her?
I think so. I knew she had a sense of humor, right? People don't always write about that. I don't know that I lingered on it, but and I knew. When people wrote that they met Garbo and she didn't say anything, she was just taciturn, and they would say very uninteresting. I came to realize she just didn't trust them, you know, and so they're looking at it from their perspective. I met Garbo and she didn't talk to me. And the answer is, well, yeah, she didn't talk to you because she didn't want to tell you things, not that you're the most captivating individual in the world, and of course she should have spoken with you. Because what I saw was her friends who often did not talk about her much, when they did talk about her, had these funny stories. So there's a woman, Jessica Dragonette, who was a singer and had a career mostly pre-war. And when she married, she stopped singing professionally for the most part. Well, for I think it's about 20 years, if they were both in New York at the same time, they had breakfast together twice a week, right? I mean, that's pretty close friendship if you're having, two breakfasts a week with somebody plus other social
Yeah.
occasions. So Jessica Dragonette, in her autobiography, only told one Garbo story. I'm sure she could have told 50, but she told one. And the one was during the war at a party at Dragonette's. Um, she jumped up on the sofa and said, "Will you vote for me for president?" This was right before an election, you know. And I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but it was sort of like, I used to be in film and I need something to do, right? She's just having fun with it. Uh, and that to me was a story that I could see happening because, it was sort of this funny riff on, what the current news was and herself and doing it in a way that was humorous. So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to me, especially given how wide her social network was, how few people told anything more than one story. David Niven told a story, and they were very close, um, that his ex-wife had already told in his book, right? So he not only did he just tell one story, he didn't even tell a new one.
And I imagine that she liked that. I mean, she liked, she was a private person and she liked people to keep her privacy.
Well, I
So,
think,
yeah.
yeah, she said this at one point. She said, I don't understand why people care about my private life. I'm just an actor. I do my job. I just want to go home. But, I think unfortunately for her, acting isn't that kind of profession. It's like being a sports star. Everybody wants to know everything about you. Nobody wants to know what my plumber does after he finishes work.
Now he may be interesting. You never know. Well, my guest today has been Scott Reisfield. He is the grandnephew of Greta Garbo, and his new book. It's out now. It's called Greta Garbo and the Rise of the Modern Woman, and it gives you a view of Greta Garbo. I'll be honest with you, Scott, that I never knew. And I really enjoyed reading it and looking at her humor and the way she was in private life. So I really want to thank you for joining us today on Lights Camera Author.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I hope my book gives a sense of what Garbo's place was in women's history, because it's important.
Exactly. And everybody, please like and subscribe. Shameless plug as always. And in the lower left-hand corner is a QR code. It'll take you to Amazon and you can order Scott's book. So, Scott, thanks again. And until next time, I'm Jim Juno, and keep reading, keep watching, and keep discovering the stories behind the stories. This has been Light Camera Author.